I'm so happy to have you all here with me in Zoom, as well as our Facebook audience. Like I said, we're doing live streaming, so just working out the glitches there, and all is well now. And once again, I'm so glad to have my partnering colleagues in this incredible program series. This is our third program for our, once again, Charlotte Street Artist Virtual Walk. So I'm going to reintroduce my collaborative partners. Once again, I have Christine Boutros, who is the manager for grants and awards programs. And then I also have the wonderful Hope Benson from Charlotte Street, who is the manager of marketing and outreach. And wonderful, I'm seeing everyone looks great. And we are very excited to have with us this evening installation artist, a career readiness coordinator at the Kansas City Art Institute, and the 2020 Visual Arts Fellow, Cory Imig. So Cory, please come on. Wonderful. So it's so important that we have these opportunities to support our artists and to give them these important platforms within these institutions so that they can share their creative voices with the community. That is what makes Kansas City great. And so we're honored to have Cory share her story with us tonight. So Hope, next slide, please. Okay, wonderful. So as you all are participating and watching, you have your choice of views. You can do the speaker view, gallery view, and then we also have captioning available. And so feel free to engage, click the CC button on the Zoom, and that way you can have captioning should you need it. Hope, next slide, please. We certainly want you to engage with us and to engage with Cory. So please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And because this is a safe place for dialogue, we ask that everyone please be respectful of our presenters and our guests when you are submitting your questions in the Q&A. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Christine.
Thanks, Krishan, and it has been a pleasure working with you these last few months on this program. So a little bit about Charlotte Street. So if you don't know who we are here and think of ourselves as an exciting home and community for contemporary artists of all disciplines and career stages. Our programs include artist residencies, which provides free studio spaces to artists, as well as grants and awards to fund artists' work. Charlotte Street's grand opening takes place this June 11th and 12th, celebrating our new campus at 3333 Wyoming Street in Midtown Kansas City, which will operate over 100 free events. Our longest running program, the Visual Artists Award, was started in 1997. And since that time, Charlotte Street has supported over 125 outstanding artists living in Kansas City through annual unrestricted cash awards distributed directly to 3 visual artists. Currently there are 5 awards of $10,000 and each are awarded annually to 3 visual artists and 2 to performing artists. Over the years, we have granted over $1 million to local artists in the community through these awards. From 2011 to 2015, Charlotte Street Artist Awardees were invited to lead individual walking tours at the Nelson-Atkins, highlighting 3 to 4 collection pieces that were meaningful to them, followed by a presentation of each of the artists' work. This 2021 reboot of the program in a virtual format features all 5 of Charlotte Street's award winners who were granted funds in 2020. So this evening, we're really excited to have Cory Imig. And Cory is an artist and an arts administrator based here in Kansas City. She has exhibited in numerous exhibitions across the United States, such as the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, the Savannah College of Art, and the Southwest School of Art in San Antonio. She has attended residencies at Aromai International Art Center, ACA, and the Vermont Studio Center. Cory was one of the founding members of Plug Projects here in Kansas City, a curatorial collaboration in the Stockyards District, as well as Say Uncle, which was a 3-year nomadic residency and exhibition program in Central Illinois, and a founder of Beyond Alternatives, a symposium which focused on artist-led projects happening outside of large metropolitan areas. Currently, she is working on a large-scale multi-year project in practical spaces with Dulcie Bohm and Patty Johnson that documents the history of artist-run spaces across the country. So thank you all of you tonight for joining us. And now we are going to hear from Cory.
Thank you, Christine, for that great introduction. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you all for joining. Thanks to Charlotte Street and the Nelson, too, for inviting me to do this. Krishan, let's go ahead and watch the video. My name is Cory Imig. I am an installation artist. I make large-scale site-specific installations that ask the viewer to question space. So they alter space physically, visually, and temporally. So when I'm first starting a piece, usually I start with the space itself and just spending time in the space, really looking at it, studying the floors and the walls, finding things that might be a little bit different about the space, and that's usually where my installations start. Then I do a lot of sketching and drawing, coming up with ideas of how my pieces could fit into that space. And then from there is how I determine what exactly I'm gonna make. So with my installations, oftentimes they're blurring the line between what the work is and what the space is. And I find it interesting how it asks the viewers to reimagine how they interact with that specific space or how they move through it, and how they interact with the work as well. So I think the architecture, space, time, those are things that really drive my practice. When I think about satisfaction from making work, it's more through the process of making than necessarily the finished piece. But the ideas, coming up with ideas and the actual process of making is usually my process is very process-based and very repetitive. I come from a background, I studied fiber. And if you think about fiber processes like sewing, knitting, weaving, they're all the same motion over and over and over again. And while my work might not still typically look like fiber-based work, the processes involved are very similar, where it's cutting, for example, with some of the ribbon installations, oftentimes there's thousands of pieces of ribbon. So it's a lot of measuring and cutting pieces at exactly the same length over and over and over again. I think right now my progression as an artist is becoming more focused, but I also think having space for it to open back up and kind of decide, is this still this series of questions that I want to pursue? Is this still the type of work I want to make? I want to make sure I leave room for that as well. One of the pieces that I'm really inspired by in the Nelson collection is The Sleepers by Sophie Kaye. She invited, over the course of a week, invited strangers to come and sleep in her bed, and then she would photograph them hourly. And they could be sleeping, they could be eating, whatever they want to do during the set time frame that she had invited them to occupy her bed. And whatever photographs and kind of written documentation came out of that week is what the piece ended up being. That got me really excited about the different forms that art can take, and that art can be about ideas and not just a visual representation. Another piece in the museum collection that anytime I'm at the museum, I love to go and look at is Felix Gonzalez Torres' work, which is called Untitled March 5th, number 2. This is one of his string light pieces, and I think he's made several of these. They're memorial pieces to his partner who passed away from AIDS. But this particular piece at the museum, there's 2 light bulbs, and inevitably one will go out before the other. And this was his way of kind of reminding us about life and how quickly and that it can change and we can lose people. But overall, I think Torres's work is so poetic, and he does it by using such simple actions, whether it's putting like 2 clocks next to each other or hanging 2 light bulbs. His ideas are so simple, but they're packed with so much meaning. The last piece that I selected is Donald Judd's Large Stack. And I selected this piece because I feel like I have like a love-hate relationship with Donald Judd, where I think minimalism, you can see direct connections to minimalism in my work. But there's also, like, through reading a lot of his writing about minimalism, specifically his article, Specific Objects, is one of those things that becomes really kind of frustrating. And just his views of what art is and should be. And, in that article, he claims that the art that he's making is transcends being called painting or sculpture. And it's this brand new thing that's considering space in this entirely new way. And so there's parts of that I really relate to with my work, and there's parts of that really frustrate me in terms of him saying like what is and what is not art. But I do get really inspired by his work. Donald Judd actually spent a lot of his young years in Excelsior Springs and talks about being really inspired by that landscape and the mill that's there. And I think there is an article that maybe it was in the 70s that he came to Kansas City and he wrote about Dale Eldred's work, and he visited the museum, the Nelson Museum, and that was in there as well.
Thanks, Krishan. So, Cory, still waiting for some questions to come through. So please, anyone, if you have any questions for Cory, type them into the Q&A. But I would like to start. Well, first of all, I really want to know more about the balloons and how you got those balloons up to do what they did. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project for those of us who aren't familiar with it?
Yes, definitely. So I was making a lot of work with balloons from about maybe 2011 until 2015. And you saw a couple examples in that video, but most of the pieces were made with balloons that were just filled with air and were suspended in the installations, either with masking tape or through bungee cords. But there was one image you saw, I think it was the second balloon image, that those balloons were actually filled with helium. And if you've ever filled up balloons for a birthday party with helium, you might know that depending on the conditions of where you store the balloon, helium will stay in the balloon for different lengths of time. So if it's really cold, helium escapes the balloons faster, or if it's really hot. And this particular installation was in Chicago, and it was in an artist-run space. So a space that was really kind of DIY. Maybe it was like some other type of storefront for a while, and some artists got their hands on it and became a gallery like overnight. So there was no climate, it was not a climate controlled space. And I had this idea to fill these balloons with helium and basically use masking tape to try to like put that installation together. So that's what you were looking at. The blue lines were masking tape and the yellow balloons were filled with helium. And the exhibition opening was, I think, about 4 hours long. And during the course of the exhibition, it was really cold in Chicago that day. So it was really cool. It started off like the picture, like the balloons were really full and all the tape lines were perfect and measured. And then over the course of the opening, and there were a lot of people in the room, the balloons lost helium really quickly. And it started to sag. And as people walked by it, the balloons would really start to sway back and forth. And it became almost like a really interactive, performative piece that you could actually dance with. And that was totally unexpected. I knew that it would lose helium, but I thought it'd be like over the course of the exhibition, not like during the time that it was open. So that was pretty fun experience.
That sounds really cool. And just I guess, well, I guess it brings me to this next question, about space, and because you talk a lot about space and how you want people to interact with it. And I guess in this case, it was very impromptu, and how the balloons were sort of interacting, but I could only imagine how people were too with that particular piece. But you really, when you think about space, I sense like a lot of, there's a lot of architectural, you've taken a lot of architectural perspectives, I feel. So I'm just kind of curious, like deep down, do you wish you were an architect or an engineer? Like it's because it's very process based.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think looking back now, that might have been a great career choice for me to make. But at the time when I was in school, my friends, I had a lot of friends that were architects in my undergrad, and it all seemed really mathematical. There was a lot of precision, a lot of model building. And to be honest, I didn't really know that I had such an interest in space at that time. I wasn't really attracted to buildings necessarily. But as I started making, I realized space is actually a really big component of what I make, and probably one of the most important materials that I use. And as I got to know more people in architecture, they started to show me diagrams of diagrams of how people move through a space. And it became really interesting to me to think, oh, you could design a building around how you want people to interact, or the function of what they're doing. And I think that's something that I realized, like, oh, I'm really interested in that. But it took me really getting into making things to even realize I had an interest in space.
So do you think about the functionality then of your works in that case? Because when you think about architecture, yeah, I mean, of course, there's a very, there's an aesthetic side to it, but there's also about, its function and its usefulness to, to people and things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess I think about function in terms of how my work may divide up a space or cause people to navigate a space differently. But in terms of function and use, I don't know. I don't know how useful and practical my work may be, but I definitely think a lot about, like, when I'm installing it, where and how it will change the way people navigate a space and what they might realize about that space. And I also tell you, I'm in my studio and there's a train coming by, so we might hear that. So I apologize.
No problem. So another thing that you sort of spoke a little bit about was repetition. And it's been really interesting because I feel like the other artists who've been part of this series have also really sort of talked about the meaning of repetition to them. And there's something, it's more than just doing things over and over again, but there's something quite deep about it. How do you feel about repetition? Like,
Yeah.
something more to it than just you having to do things over and over again, or does it hold more meaning?
I think repetition, it's definitely like calming. It's nice to know like what I'm supposed to do, which sometimes when I'm making, I get a lot of anxiety in terms of like, well, there's not necessarily always a plan for making a work. It's not like you can open up your IKEA box and come out with a set of instructions on like what the steps are. So it is nice to have part of that process that's like, okay, I just need to sit here and cut this thing this many times and I'll have made a step forward. And I think it's really interesting. My nieces were in town from Colorado this past weekend, and one of them, she's 7, she got this little, my mom had given her like a craft kit to learn how to sew, and she spends about 10 minutes doing it, and she looks at me and she's like, this is actually really calming. I really like sewing. And I was like, wow, she got to that within 10 minutes. Yeah. That this is like this meditative activity. And I mean, I think that is a big part of it for me.
Okay, so Donald Judd, I thought it was really interesting how you described your relationship with him or your feelings about him, your love-hate relationship, and your frustrations about how or what his opinions are about art or what isn't art. I guess I want to know, like, at the heart of it, what is it that you found most grating about him?
Well, a lot of it is, I can only assume from his reading, like from his writing, like how he intends things. And I wouldn't just say, it's probably not just with Donald Judd. It's probably with all of those. If you type minimalism into Google, you see a bunch of old white men that are making, pretty much the same work with some of the same materials, and they have a lot of the same viewpoints. Donald Judd was one of them that maybe just wrote them down and it got published more. But, I did go to Marfa on a road trip a few years ago, and Marfa is in this really rural part of Texas. And it's kind of, Donald Judd bought some old army forts there so he could make like his ideal museum, which basically he thought like if an artist made a piece, it should never be deinstalled. It should be like a permanent, like all installations or all work should be permanent. So he bought like so much property and he's like created, it's really quite amazing when you go there. And so there's something I'm really drawn to, but also something that I'm just like, I don't know if this is right. Like, how can you tell people that like what they're doing is not art and art is only what you think it is, and that whatever you're making is better and more advanced than someone who's painting or someone who's also making something 3-dimensionally, but maybe not thinking about the way it occupies a space in the same way. So there's definitely like kind of that conceptualism of minimalism is really interesting to me, but I don't know if I think it's like the only type of art.
Yeah. So I have some questions from our audience here. So on Facebook, Tom Woodbury is asking, well, he's asking us to go back to the topic of space and bring in the idea of permanence or transitory experience.
Yeah.
I guess, do you think about that? Like, is this space, are you wanting it to feel permanent?
I've never made anything that could be permanent. The materials that I've used, are things like ribbon that wouldn't really stand in the elements, or masking tape, or balloons, or bungee cords. They're kind of these like everyday like not really industrial materials, but things you could find at hardware stores or craft stores. And I've been asked to make permanent installations, but I think there's a big, I don't think I'm there yet. I think a big part of it is materiality. I really like to know the material and touch and make. So when I'm thinking about translating some of these ideas into using permanent or materials that could be permanent, I kind of lose interest, and it kind of becomes this thing that I'm not able to really fully grasp.
Got it. Okay, so we're almost at time, but can I squeeze in one more question, Cory?
Yes.
Okay, and oh, here we are. So we have a question here. There's a precision to your work that I very much appreciate, but the thing that strikes me most about it is the inherent sensitivity it ultimately displays. Would you say your creative process at the beginning of a project is mainly intuitive or more, for lack of a better word, scientific?
You know, I think I would answer that question differently now than I would have maybe a few years ago. I think there's definitely a large, maybe with the installations, it's more intuitive. It's about, you know, really being in the space and kind of finding the areas of a space that really interest me, and then thinking about what could happen there. And it's more thinking about that becomes a more spatial exercise than necessarily like thinking about like what exactly would happen, like what exact materials or what exact installation. But I know in the video there was an image of a pier with a bunch of yellow, or not yellow, I'm sorry, pink bars coming off of it. And I don't know if you remember that. I know it flashed up there really quick, but that was actually a sketch of an installation I did, a temporary public art installation on a beach in Tybee Island in Georgia. And it, you know, I had no idea what the material for that would be. It was just like, what could happen if there's something coming off the pier and coming into the sand, like at this interval. So I think a lot of my ideas kind of start that way, where it's like more intuitive in that way of like what part of a space strikes me as I'm walking through a space, like what type of experience am I having, and what would I want, how do I want my installations to kind of shape others' experience.
Right. Well, thanks for that, Cory. And we are at time. There were a few more questions, but
I'm right ahead. The reason that we're at time, right, is basically my fault. So if we still got
okay, all right. Can I ask?
Right ahead.
Okay, thank you. All right. So this is from Hope. So Hope here mentions implicit functions architecture has had, sorry, let me look at this again. I'm interested in knowing how you consider scale in your works, and even thinking about architecture more broadly in urban mapping and development, similar to Donald Judd's essays on New York's developing East Side. What elements most compel you in urban or architectural space?
Well, in terms of scale, okay, sorry, I got a little pop-up. In terms of scale, I guess, I think a lot of about my work is site sensitive, where site specific, I feel, usually refers to oftentimes the history, or like really specifically a place. Whereas a lot of times my installations are looking purely at the architecture of the space, and they're sensitive to that. And a lot of times they can expand and contract and fit within different spaces. So I think in terms of scale, you know, I kind of view the installations to kind of be whatever size that it needs to be to achieve the result that I'm hoping for. So sometimes they could be, you know, they kind of expand and contract when needed. And I'm not exactly sure, Hope, where you're headed with the question with urban spaces, but it did trigger something in my mind when I was making that installation for the beach. I had a really hard time, and I thought about it, and I was like, why is this so difficult? And I realized it was because there's no buildings on the beach. It was just open, and there was no way for my work to have there was nothing next to it to make it have any sense of scale. When you're just looking out at it into the ocean and this huge expansive sandy beach, there's just anything you put on it's going to be small. And that's when I realized, I was like, oh, I have to use the pier. That is the only like architectural element that's on this beach, and it's the only way that I can really like make sense of that space. So I had done a lot of drawings of like things that I would like stick into the stand that would stick out, but everything was like falling really flat and I couldn't figure it out. But so it made me realize just like how important architecture is to my work.
That's actually, that's really fascinating. Like, because we don't often think about how space places boundaries, or how I think I've said this to you before, how we impose on space. You know, sometimes it goes unnoticeable, and then other times, like, you know, you start to perhaps think about like, oh, that person's playing their music really loud in my space, you know, like, or yeah, so things like that. But it's the same thing with the physical elements too. So I think that's really interesting. So Cory, any final comments before we say our goodbyes?
I would just say this was so hard for me to select 3 pieces. I did grow up in Kansas City, and I had gone to the museum as a child, and I had no idea at that point that I even liked art, but I knew I loved going to the art classes, and I loved the museum guard, Dwayne Hansen sculpture. And so it was really tough when I was making my decisions if I kind of selected pieces that I was drawn to as a child that were probably formative in like why I even decided to pursue art, or if I chose pieces that I feel like more directly connect to my work now. So Krishan can tell you, I sent a list of probably 50 pieces and asked her to help me narrow it down. She's like, I have no comments. So it was kind of blindly pulling in and selecting those 3, but it was really fun. I challenged myself to, you know, doing this virtually, we could kind of approach this in a little bit of a different way. The pieces, you know, didn't always have to be on display. So it gave me a great chance to go through the Nelson collection online and learn about a lot of pieces that I didn't even know were in the collection. So thank you so much for inviting me to do this. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Cory.
Thank you, Cory. As we're both saying, thank you, Cory. And certainly thank you, Christine. You all have been great. Thanks for all of your patience to our viewing audience here on Zoom and on Facebook. Cory, we appreciate you so much. And I want to invite everyone that's with us to definitely check out the remainder of the series. The link to the series should be in the chat. Thanks so much, Hope, for putting it there. And Hope, if you can go ahead and share with everyone, our upcoming Charlotte Street virtual artist will be the 2020 Generative Performing Artist Award Fellow, Stacy Bush. And Stacy will be here with us on Wednesday, July 7th. So please join us then. Thank you, everyone, and I hope that you all have a great night. Bye-bye.